The first thing I noticed that Saturday morning wasn't the silence inside the house. It was the sound coming from outside. The low, mechanical drone of Marcus's lawn mower moving in clean, even rose across his yard, the way it always did in late September when the grass made one last push before the cold shut everything down. I was standing at the kitchen window with a coffee mug that had gone lukewarm in my hand, watching him work. He moved with that easy, unhurried confidence he carried everywhere. Broad shoulders, a white t-shirt already stained with grass at the hem, one hand resting loosely on the mower's handle like he owned not just his yard but the entire street. Which, in a way, he kind of did. Marcus had sold half the houses on Birchwood Lane. He'd sold us ours. 11 years ago, Claire and I had stood in the empty living room of this house with a realtor's folder in her hands and sunlight pouring through windows that faced his yard directly. We'd liked him immediately. Everyone liked Marcus immediately. That was the thing about him. He made you feel seen without doing anything you could specifically point to afterward. I set the mug down and turned back to the kitchen. The kids were at Claire's mother's for the weekend. The house had that specific, slightly hollow quality it always got when Lily and Owen weren't in it. Quieter in a way that wasn't quite peaceful. Claire had left Friday evening. Her sister Rachel lived 40 minutes east, in Millbrook, and they had plans. A birthday dinner, she'd said, and then probably staying over because Rachel's husband was traveling and Rachel hated being alone in that house. It was a reasonable explanation. It was the kind of explanation that answered every practical question and left no obvious opening for doubt. I kissed her at the door. She smelled like the perfume she didn't usually wear on weekday evenings, and her hair was done differently, not dramatically, just the kind of difference you notice without immediately naming. Softer, maybe, looser. I told myself she was making an effort for her sister's birthday. That thought lasted about 14 hours. I didn't sleep well Friday night. Not because anything was wrong specifically. Just that particular restlessness that sometimes settles into you when the house is too quiet and your body doesn't know what to do with the absence of noise. I watched television without registering it. I ate cereal standing over the sink at midnight. I checked my phone 3 times for no reason I could have explained. Saturday morning, I texted Claire at 9. "How was the dinner?" She replied 11 minutes later, "So fun. Rachel sends love." Heading back around noon, maybe 1. Friendly. Normal. Punctuated correctly, which Claire always was. I went outside to get the newspaper. We still got the paper, one of those habits left over from before the kids, from the first years of the house, and Marcus's mower cut out as I hit the driveway. He raised a hand. "Morning, Daniel." "Marcus." I held up the paper in acknowledgement. "Kids at Diane's?" He knew our schedules the way neighbors do after enough years of shared fence lines and borrowed extension cords and impromptu driveway conversations. Nothing unusual in the question. "Yeah. Picked them up yesterday afternoon," I said. He nodded, pulled a bottle of water from his back pocket and took a long drink. There was something in his posture, a fraction of a second where his eyes didn't quite meet mine before they did, but I filed it under nothing. Marcus was one of those men who was always slightly distracted, always half thinking about the next showing or the next deal. I'd never read anything into it before. I went back inside, and I probably would have done nothing. I probably would have cleaned the gutters, watched college football, ordered a pizza, and waited for Claire to come home at 1 o'clock with a story about Rachel's new dining room furniture. I probably would have gone the rest of my life without pulling at the thread that had been sitting in front of me for, as it turned out, almost 8 months. But then my phone rang, and it was Rachel. Not a text. A call. Rachel, who texted everything, who had called me exactly twice in 11 years. Once when Claire was in a minor car accident and once to wish me happy birthday because she'd somehow lost our group chat. I answered. "Hey, Daniel." Her voice was careful, stretched thin across something she was managing. "Is Claire with you?" The kitchen felt very still. "She's at your place," I said. "Birthday dinner." A pause that lasted exactly long enough to change everything. "Daniel," Rachel said, "my birthday was in June. I have spent my professional life reading structures. Not the glamorous parts, not the glass towers or the landmark bridges, but the invisible framework beneath things. The load-bearing elements. The points where stress accumulates over time without announcing itself. until one day a wall cracks and everyone asks how they didn't see it coming. I know how they didn't see it coming. You stop looking at the things that have always held. After I hung up with Rachel, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. The coffee mug was still there, fully cold now. Outside, Marcus had started the mower again. That sound, that ordinary Saturday sound that had been the background noise of 11 years of weekends, felt different now in a way I couldn't yet fully articulate. I went back through the last several months the way you go back through a building after an inspection report comes in bad. Looking for the thing you missed, the detail you walked past because it didn't fit the pattern you expected to find. In February, Claire had joined a book club, Thursday evenings, 7 to 9, at a coffee shop downtown called Provision. She'd mentioned it casually. Her friend Jana had invited her. She needed something social. She'd been feeling isolated since the school semester picked up. All reasonable, all true-sounding. I'd encouraged it. I'd even made a point of putting the kids to bed on Thursdays so she could leave without rushing. I'd never met anyone from the book club. I'd never seen a book. In April, she'd started going to a Saturday yoga class. Not every Saturday. Maybe twice a month, sometimes 3 times. She'd come home looser, lighter, in a better mood than the weeks she stayed home. I thought it was the exercise. I thought, good. She needs this, she works hard, she carries a lot. The perfume thing went back further than I'd realized. Sitting there at that table. March, maybe. She'd bought something new and said it was because the old one was discontinued. I'd believed her because why wouldn't I? Because the explanation was specific enough to sound like memory rather than invention. This is what I understand now about the architecture of deception. It doesn't announce itself with dramatic gestures. It hides inside the mundane. It uses your own trust as load-bearing material. Every reasonable explanation reinforced the next one, until the whole structure was standing not on truth but on your willingness to keep not looking too hard. I hadn't looked too hard. Not because I was careless. Because I loved her, and love in a long marriage becomes in part an act of deliberate faith, a choice to interpret ambiguity in the direction of the person you chose. I pulled out my phone and I did something I had never done in 11 years of marriage. I opened the Find My app and looked for Claire's location. She'd shared her location with me 3 years ago, after a late-night fender bender on the highway scared us both. We'd set it up mutually, laughed about becoming those people, and never actually used it. I'd forgotten it existed. The blue dot was not in Millbrook. It was not at Rachel's house. It was 0.4 miles from where I was sitting. It was on Birchwood Lane. I set the phone face down on the table very slowly. Outside, the mower kept going. That was when I understood I had already known. Not consciously, not with words, but in the way your body knows things before your mind gives it permission. The slight flinch when Marcus's name came up in certain conversations. The way Claire had started using his name less over the past few months, as if she was managing how often she said it. The fact that I could not, right now, remember the last time all 3 of us had stood in a driveway talking the way we used to. I had called it coincidence. I would not call it that anymore. What I did next surprised me. I didn't drive the 0.4 miles. I didn't call her. I went upstairs, changed into work clothes, and came back down to the garage. I found the gutter cleaning equipment I'd been meaning to use for 3 weeks. And I climbed up on the roof of my own house and I started working. I needed to do something with my hands. I needed to be above ground level. I needed, I think, to have a view. From the roof of my house on Birchwood Lane, I could see over the fence line into Marcus's backyard. His car was in the driveway, the gray Audi he'd bought last spring. His mower was still running on the front lawn, set to idle, but Marcus himself was no longer behind it. I worked on the gutters for 45 minutes. I did not let myself think in complete sentences. I just cleared the debris, leaves, packed silt, a bird's nest in the downspout, and I focused on the texture of the work, the weight of what I was pulling out, the sound of the water test I ran when the channel was clear. She texted at 11:40, leaving Rachel's soon. Want me to pick up lunch? I read it twice. Replied, sure, whatever you feel like. Climbed back down. Put the equipment away. Made the bed which I'd left unmade. Did the breakfast dishes. Emptied the coffee from the pot. By the time her car pulled into the driveway at 12:50, The house was clean and I was sitting at the kitchen table with the newspaper open in front of me, reading nothing. She came in through the back door, which should have been the first thing I noticed. She always used the front when the kids weren't with her, had done it since we moved in because the front door had a better lock and she felt safer. The back door was the kids' door, the mudroom door, the door for when your hands were full of grocery bags. Her hands weren't full of anything. Hey! She set her purse on the counter and opened the refrigerator, standing with her back to me. Rachel says hi. She's thinking about redoing her kitchen. Wants our opinion at Christmas. How's she doing? Good. Tired. You know how she gets when Derek travels. Every word landed with a specific weight. Rachel. Derek. Kitchen. Normal furniture of a story that didn't exist. I had spent the morning telling myself I would confront her directly, ask her plainly, but sitting across from her now, watching her pour herself a glass of water, pull her hair back, toe off her shoes the way she'd done 10,000 times in this kitchen. I found I couldn't do it yet. Not because I was afraid of her answer, because I needed to understand the shape of what I was dealing with before I moved toward it. A structural engineer's instinct. Don't touch the load-bearing wall until you know what's resting on it. Marcus was mowing this morning, I said. Neutral. She took a drink of water. He's always out there on Saturdays. He wasn't out front when you pulled in. A half beat. Almost nothing. I didn't notice. That pause, I cataloged it without reacting to it. Filed it next to the perfume, the book club, the blue dot at 0.4 miles. Something had shifted in our house over the last months, and I'd been reading it wrong. I'd attributed her restlessness to the school year's pressure, her distraction to a difficult parent-teacher stretch, her occasional emotional distance to the normal ebb of a long marriage. Claire had always run warm and cool. It was part of her, part of what made her complicated and interesting. I'd learned not to chase every shift in her temperature. What I hadn't understood was that someone else had been reading her temperature too. More carefully, more recently. That afternoon I watched her in ways I hadn't in years. Not suspiciously or not obviously. I watched the way she picked up her phone and turned the screen slightly away when she sat on the couch beside me. The way she laughed a little too quickly at something on television. Like she was performing ease. The way she went to bed early and lay very still, which wasn't how Claire slept. She was a restless sleeper, a tosser, someone who always ended up with one leg outside the blanket. She was controlling her body, keeping it quiet. Lily called from her grandmother's at 8 to report that Owen had eaten an entire sleeve of crackers before dinner and was now being dramatic about his stomach. Claire laughed for real that time. Genuine, unguarded, her whole face involved. And watching her in that 30-second window, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel: grief. Not anger, not betrayal, not yet. Just a clean, cold grief for the person I'd built a life with, and the growing certainty that something in that life had already quietly ended without my consent. That night, after she fell asleep, I went downstairs, sat in the kitchen in the dark. Outside, Marcus's porch light was on. His house was quiet. I had known Marcus Heller for 9 years. We'd shared a fence for 9 years. I'd watched his marriage to Sandra fall apart. They divorced 4 years ago. No kids. Sandra moved to Portland, and I thought it was a shame. Thought Marcus seemed lonely after. Invited him to things. Cookouts. New Year's. The kids' birthday parties. He was good with Lily and Owen. He remembered their interests, brought appropriate gifts, never made the afternoon about himself. I sat in my dark kitchen and I thought about all the times I'd handed him that access. Introduced him to the interior of my family. Stood in my own driveway and told him things about my marriage. Nothing serious, nothing intimate, but the texture of it. The rhythms, the stresses, the ways Claire and I rubbed against each other when the kids were difficult or work was heavy. I had given him a map. I'd given it to him willingly, in the way you give things to someone you trust completely because it never once occurred to you not to. I hadn't been building a friendship. I'd been building something else without knowing it. And I understood then that whatever had happened between them, it had not begun with Marcus alone. I want to be clear about what I did and didn't do in the 2 weeks that followed. I did not go through Claire's phone. I'm not sure I can explain exactly why. Pride, maybe, or some sense that the moment I did that I would become someone I didn't recognize. Or maybe it was simpler. I already knew the answer. What I needed was evidence that could survive the conversation I was eventually going to have with her. Something she couldn't redirect or reframe. A structural engineer gathers data methodically. You don't guess about stress fractures. The book club was the first thing I confirmed. I texted Jana, casually, the way you might text someone you've met a handful of times at school events, saying Claire had mentioned the Thursday group and I was looking for a hostess gift idea for the organizer. Jana replied within 10 minutes. What book club? Claire and I haven't hung out in forever. Wish she'd told me she joined one. One thread. Pulled. I started paying attention to the Thursdays. Not in an obvious way, I had the kids' bedtime routine to manage, which gave me cover to be home and alert without seeming to be monitoring anything. Claire left around 6:45, came back between 9 and 9:30, sometimes closer to 10. 3 Thursdays in a row, I drove past Marcus's house on my way back from picking up Owen's medication at the pharmacy. His car was there every time. No lights in the back rooms, but the kitchen window glowing. The Saturday yoga class I couldn't confirm as easily. She came home in yoga clothes. She'd done yoga before we had kids. She knew the postures, used the vocabulary naturally. Either she was actually going and doing something else before or after, or she was going somewhere else entirely and changing in a car. This is what sustained investigation actually feels like, by the way. Not cinematic, not driven by adrenaline. Tedious. Heavy. You're walking through your own life looking for evidence that your life is not what you believed it was, and the whole time the life itself keeps going. Kids' homework, dinner, school emails, a leak under the bathroom sink that needed fixing. You keep functioning. You have to. The red herring arrived in week 2, and it almost derailed everything. I found a receipt in the pocket of Claire's jacket. A jacket I'd taken to the dry cleaner because the season was turning. A restaurant receipt. Amelia's, downtown, the kind of place couples went for anniversaries. 2 entrees. 1 bottle of wine. October 4th, a Thursday. I spent 3 days certain this was it. Certain this was the confirmation I needed. I almost confronted her on a Tuesday night, with the kids asleep upstairs, based on that piece of paper. What stopped me was a detail so small I almost dismissed it. The table number on the receipt was 14. I'd been to Amelia's. Table 14 was in the back corner, the booth nearest the kitchen, the worst seat in the house, the one they gave walk-ins and parties without reservations. No one conducting a secret affair chose that table. You chose that table when you didn't have a choice. I called Amelia's and said I'd left a scarf there in early October and asked if there was any way to check their records. The hostess looked it up and told me they'd had a work party of 12 from Crestwood Elementary that evening. A retirement dinner for a teacher named Garrison, who I vaguely remembered Claire mentioning had been there for 30 years. Not Marcus. A colleague's retirement. I'd almost blown everything on a dry cleaning receipt. That mistake recalibrated me. I needed something direct. Something that didn't require interpretation. The answer came from the last place I expected. Lily. She came home from her grandmother's with a drawing she'd made. A family portrait, houses, a neighborhood. Her artwork at 9 was getting genuinely good. She had a careful eye for proportion. She'd drawn our house, our family, Marcus's house. And in her drawing, Marcus was standing in his yard, waving. Next to him, slightly behind, was a figure she'd drawn in a yellow dress. Who's that next to Marcus? I asked, keeping my voice easy. Lily looked at the drawing. That's Mommy. They talk a lot. She said it the way 9-year-olds state facts, no weight to it, no awareness of its gravity. Just something she'd seen and documented. When did you see that, Lil? I don't know. A lot of times. When you're at work. She went back to her drawing. I stood in the kitchen doorway and tried to keep my expression exactly where it was. A 9-year-old had seen what I'd spent months not seeing. The confrontation happened on a Wednesday evening, 11 days after Rachel's phone call. The kids were at a sleepover at a classmate's house, an arrangement Claire had made 2 weeks earlier that, in retrospect, may or may not have been coincidental. I chose not to overthink which. I made dinner. Something simple, pasta, a salad, a bottle of wine I opened but didn't pour. I'd thought about the right setting for this moment and decided the kitchen table was it. Not the living room, not a neutral public place. Here. where we'd eaten 1,000 meals, where the ordinary weight of everything that was about to end could be felt properly. She came in from work at 5:50, still in her coat, and stopped when she saw the table set. "Oh," something moved across her face. "I didn't know you were cooking. Sit down, Claire." She knew. I could see it the moment I said her name with that particular flatness. Not angry, not trembling, just level. She'd been married to me long enough to know what that voice meant. She pulled out her chair and sat down slowly, still in her coat, her bag still on her shoulder. I told her what I knew. Not everything. I left out Lily's drawing, because I didn't want our daughter's name in this conversation. But Rachel's call, the location data, Jana's text, the Thursday nights, Marcus's car. I laid it out the way your present findings in a structural report, not with emotion but with sequence. This, then this, then this. She didn't deny it. What she did instead was something I hadn't prepared for. She started crying quietly, before I'd finished, and she didn't try to stop. No defensive posture, no counter-argument. Just that soundless, steady kind of crying that isn't performance. "How long?" I asked. 7 months. Her voice was barely there. 7 months. Since March, which meant the perfume, the book club, the yoga class, all of it. A 7-month architecture of lies installed inside a life we'd built together over 11 years. "Is it love?" I asked. I hadn't planned to ask that. Came out before I could stop it, and I don't regret it, because her answer told me more than anything else would have. She looked at the table. "I don't know," which meant yes, or something close enough to yes that the distinction didn't matter. We talked for 2 hours. I will not reconstruct every part of it. Some of what was said belongs only in that kitchen to those 2 people. But I will say that Claire did not make excuses, at least not the obvious ones. She didn't say the marriage was broken or that I'd failed her in some fundamental way. She said she'd felt something, and she hadn't stopped it, and she was sorry, and she knew that wasn't enough. I asked her one more question before we stopped for the night. "Does Marcus know you're telling me this?" She shook her head. "He doesn't know I got found out." I sat with that for a moment. The man who had been mowing his lawn next to mine every Saturday for 9 years didn't know his Saturday was about to change. "Okay," I said. I poured the wine back in the bottle, covered the pasta, told Claire I was going to stay at a hotel for 2 nights, and that we would talk more when I was ready. She didn't argue. I drove past Marcus's house on the way out. His lights were on. His gray Audi was in the driveway. The lawn was neat. He'd done it just last Saturday while I'd been standing at my kitchen window watching him, not yet knowing, already somehow knowing. I didn't stop. I kept driving. The divorce took 8 months. Not contentious or not dramatically so. We were both too exhausted by then for combat, and we had 2 children who needed us to be functional adults more than we needed to be right. We split things equitably. I kept the house, which surprised some people. I think Claire assumed I'd want to leave it. But Lily and Owen knew that house. It was the only home they remembered. I wasn't going to take their rooms from them because their mother had made a different kind of choice. Marcus sold his house 4 months after everything came out. I don't know if he sold it because of shame or because the proximity became untenable once Claire moved into her apartment near the school. Maybe both. I watched the for sale sign go up on a Tuesday morning in February, and I felt almost nothing. Not satisfaction, not grief, just a kind of low recognition, the way you feel when a weather forecast turns out to be correct. I didn't speak to him directly. There was a point, about 6 weeks after the kitchen conversation, when I considered it. Drove past his house one evening and sat there for a while trying to decide if there was anything I actually wanted to say to him. I realized there wasn't. Not because I'd forgiven him. Because there's a category of person you can be angry at forever without them deserving any more of your time. Lily and Owen adjusted in the way children adjust to things you never wanted them to have to adjust to, with a resilience that broke my heart a little, and a practicality that reminded me how much tougher they were than I'd given them credit for. Lily asked me once, about 3 months in, if I was sad. I told her yes, sometimes. She thought about it and said, "But you seem like yourself again." I didn't know what to say to that. Mostly because she was right. Claire asked in April of the following year if we could talk about trying again. Not those words exactly, nothing so clean or direct. She texted asking if I wanted to have coffee, and her tone made the subtext clear. We had coffee. She looked tired in the way that isn't just physical. She'd ended things with Marcus when the house sold. I found that out through a version of the Crestwood Falls grapevine that I hadn't asked to be part of. I listened to what she said. I didn't interrupt. I told her I was glad she seemed to be doing okay. And I meant it. And then I told her, as gently as I could, that the door wasn't open anymore. Not as punishment, just as truth. Some doors, once closed, aren't closed out of anger. They're closed because you finally understand what the room behind them actually contains. I had spent 11 years in a marriage I loved, to a person I loved, in a house where I'd built a life I was proud of. And I had come through the other side of its ending and discovered something I genuinely hadn't expected. I was still standing, still functional, still, as Lily had noticed, myself. That turned out to be enough. More than enough, actually. Owen asked me one Saturday morning. He'd be 7 by then, round-faced and earnest in the way he always was, if Marcus would ever come back to mow his lawn. I hadn't realized he'd noticed the house had new neighbors. I told him no. He thought about it for a second and then said, "That's okay." His mower was kind of loud anyway. He went back to his cereal. I sat at the kitchen table where I delivered the truth about my own marriage, in my own house, with the morning light coming through the window that faced the yard where a gray Audi no longer sat, and I laughed. Quietly, by myself, in the way you laugh when something is sad and true and also, unexpectedly, a little bit okay. The spring after that, I redid the fence line. Hired someone to pull the old posts and install new cedar boards, taller, a different style. The new neighbors were a young couple, a teacher and a nurse, with a baby and a golden retriever that barked at squirrels. They were friendly in that careful way new neighbors are when they don't yet know your story. I introduced myself. They introduced themselves. The dog barked once at nothing, then settled. The grass on both sides of the fence was just starting to come in. What this story ultimately traces is not a betrayal, or not only that. It traces the slow collapse of a particular kind of trust. The kind so embedded in daily life that it stopped being felt as trust at all, and became simply the invisible framework everything else rested on. Daniel's marriage didn't crack in the 7 months Claire spent lying. It cracked in the years before that, in the accumulation of small moments where concern wasn't raised, questions weren't asked, and the growing distance between two people was interpreted as the normal friction of a long life together rather than a warning. He was, by his own admission, good at maintaining appearances, good at keeping the structure upright. What he'd lost track of was whether anything real was still being held up by it. The deeper psychological truth the story reveals is about the cost of chosen blindness. Daniel wasn't naive. He was perceptive enough to register every signal, to notice the perfume, the altered routines, the silence where there used to be sound. What he did with those signals was suppress them, reclassify them as coincidence, feed them into a framework of faith that had stopped being faith and become avoidance. That distinction matters enormously. Faith is a choice made in the presence of doubt. Avoidance is a choice made to prevent doubt from being examined. Marcus represents something more troubling than a rival. He represents the version of intimacy that can develop between two people through proximity and permission. Slow, accumulative, unannounced. Daniel had handed him the texture of his marriage in pieces, over 9 years, across fence lines and driveways and birthday parties. Not deliberately, not carelessly either, simply as the natural overflow of living next to someone you trust. The betrayal was built, partially, from materials Daniel provided. What endures after the story ends is not bitterness. It's clarity. And that distinction between a man who was broken by what happened and a man who was clarified by it is where the real architecture of the story lives. What stays with me about Daniel's story is something quiet, not the affair itself and not even the confrontation. It's that 9-year-old drawing. A child who saw clearly what the adults had organized their lives around not seeing. She drew it with careful lines and appropriate proportions, the way children document their world. Without judgment, without agenda, just what was there. We spend so much energy building the explanations that let us stay comfortable. The reasonable answers, the convenient assumptions, the faith that doubles as avoidance. And sometimes it takes something completely outside that system, A phone call from a sister, a daughter's homework project, to show us the shape of what we'd already been looking at. I think the question worth sitting with isn't why Claire did what she did. It's why it took so long for the obvious to become visible. Not because Daniel was blind, because he was human. And humans are extraordinarily skilled at not seeing the thing that would cost the most to see. That's not a flaw. It's just part of how we survive. The real strength is in what happens after, when you finally let yourself look.